All right, again, thank you all for joining us today. My name is DeWitt Wesson. I'm from Aljoya Thornton Place. We are situated near Thornton Creek in Northgate, and we are conveniently located near a lot of shopping close to the highway. I'd also like to remind everyone that we have a few apartments available, and if you have any questions about them or would like to schedule a tour or virtual tour, please contact us. And without further ado, let's get started. So I am delighted to introduce Dr. Kristofører Rhoads, who is a clinical neuropsychologist and specializing in evaluating treatment of dementia and neurodegenerative disorders. He currently serves as the primary neuropsychologist for the UW Memory and Brain Wellness Center at Harborview and is an associate professor in the Department of Neurology the Department of Neurology at the University of Washington School of Meditation. He has joined us today to present how does mindful meditation promote brain health. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to him.
All right, DeWitt, thank you so much for both the introduction as well as the technical support and the reminders of the ways that we can and should use Zoom. It's still all new. It feels like it's been forever. So let me make sure I can share my slides. Hopefully those look okay. I'm guessing they are all right. So thank you for joining today. I appreciate you taking the time and signing up for yet another screen-oriented activity. My appreciation for Arrow Living and Aljoya Thornton Place for the opportunity to do this. So I'm happy today to be able to talk about this. This is one of the things that is near and dear to my heart as a neuropsychologist, but particularly just as a person, as an individual. And wanted to spend some time talking about how meditation fits into the ways we think about resilience and cognitive function, and also how it interfaces with some of the more pathological changes in memory, including Alzheimer's disease. So my hope today is to increase your familiarity with mindfulness-based stress reduction programs and mindfulness as a concept, if it's not something you're already familiar with. Very, very kind of high level, how does this interact with the central nervous system and neurobiology? And then what are some specific applications, particularly for people who are coping with memory loss in one way or another? And that could be you have cognitive changes. It could be that you are a care partner for somebody with cognitive changes. So it's helpful in a couple of ways. We will do some very kind of brief definitions, and then again, I want to move into more the kind of how does this fit with memory loss, and give you some resources. That's always one of the more important things. The other thing is I'm hoping to do this in about 45 minutes and save a few minutes for questions. I will try to keep an eye on the chat also. My multitasking abilities start to wane at this point in the day, but I'll do what I can. And then I'll definitely give you my contact information for any kind of follow-up things I can help with. So mindfulness is everywhere these days. I was recently asked to do an interview around mindfulness meditation and diaphragmic breathing for Women's Day magazine. And you can find it as applies to stress management, as how it applies to coping with adversity or increasing one's kind of internal sense of calm. It is really fairly simple, but not easy. And I think just in terms of thinking of it as a concept, it's certainly related to meditation practices, but it is not fully constrained to them. And it doesn't follow one very specific kind of dogmatic approach. It really is the non-judgmental awareness of what is happening in the moment. So as I stand here, I'm standing in my office at Harborview. It is incredibly warm in my office as the sun has crested the building. I am aware of that. And it is very much focused on what's happening here and now versus then and there, including the past or the future. And one of the things I think that is most one of the harder concepts in a way is that piece of acceptance and being non-judgmental about current experience, and really kind of engaging despite difficulty versus trying to avoid it or escape it. So it is not an escape or kind of a way to get out of difficulty or eliminate it from your life. The idea of mindfulness-based stress reduction or stress management, not stress elimination. I don't know how you eliminate stress, particularly given all the things in our lives that are out of our control. It is very much kind of, again, a present moment, more kind of in the being mode versus doing something, a purposeful kind of next. And very much about kind of approaching that versus avoiding it or trying to pretend like it's not there. It's also important to know that mindfulness meditation and mindfulness-based approaches are not relaxation techniques. They are not competitive. One of the things I hear from people when I introduce this as a topic clinically is that, oh, I tried meditation, I'm not good at it. It's not a good at, not good at kind of thing. And it's absolutely not a kind of an approach or a technique where you're supposed to be able to empty your mind of all thoughts. Good luck with that. I don't know how you do that. Thoughts are the natural activity and the byproduct of the brain. So to not have them would be a little unusual, and more kind of what you do with those or how much they dictate your experience, that might be a different story. So a couple of definitions by people who could define it far better than me. One would be from Jon Kabat-Zinn, including mindfulness meaning paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Thich Nhat Hanh also talking about the focus on the present moment. The past is gone, the future never really arrives, and it is this moment here in which we operate that has some influence maybe over the next moments. And you can't fully pretend that the past hasn't happened or that the future isn't something to be thinking about, but how much you dwell in either of those, I think, is an important difference versus bringing our attention back to the present moment. So I created this a while ago. I kind of think of it as the what is. And sometimes we are prone to thinking about the what was. And I hear this a lot from people either with physical or cognitive injuries who would mythologize the past and are kind of prone to that, oh, I was able to work 2 full-time jobs, clean the house, do all my errands, feed the kids, never slept, and I did everything flawlessly. And now I can't remember why I went into a particular room, or I run into somebody and I can't think of their name. Or physically, I can't do the kind of activities I used to do. So that kind of focus on what was, as well as more future-based kind of apprehension or trying to figure out if it's this bad now, what's it going to be like in 5 years? If my memory or my physical functioning is this bad in this moment, oh my gosh, it was so much better 5 years ago. What will it be like in the future? And these circles, if you can see them on the screen, are kind of the lenses through which we look at those past and future states. And each one of them distorts the vision of that. And that could be anxiety, that could be depression, that could be our own kind of biases. It's almost like, if you think about if you're in a pool of water and you're looking at something on the surface, the deeper you go, the more distorted that vision becomes. So some of the core attitudes coming from Jon Kabat-Zinn's seminal work in the early 90s is the first and foremost one, which is very difficult to cultivate, that of being non-judgmental. So again, just a simple appraisal of what is. Certainly one of patience, that this is not a striving for, this is going to help me in some way, shape, or form, or there'll be some outcome or positive byproduct of this practice. And how long is that going to take? That's another thing I hear often is, well, if I do this, how long is it going to take for my memory to be better? Or how long is it going to take for my anxiety levels to be lower? Or how long is it going to take to be able to help with falling asleep at night? And you really can't approach it with those things as goals. They may be byproducts of the process, but they may not be. And that's not the point or the reason for doing this. And that kind of freedom from being attached to those outcomes as something that's necessary to perpetuate a practice. The other one that is one of my favorites is that of the beginner's mind. And there's a great saying that in the beginner's mind, the possibilities are endless, and in the expert's mind, they are few. And I have now been in practice, clinical practice, for almost 20 years. And I strive to maintain this when you start thinking about, well, what could be causing these changes versus oh my gosh, I've done 4,000 of these evaluations, and I kind of know just by looking at the chart, this person has Alzheimer's disease. Staying open to the possibilities. And that's one of the great things about working with residents and fellows and students is they have this wonderful kind of wide range of what it could be. So same thing with mindfulness, that you approach this as a beginner every time you practice. And it really is a practice. This is not a mastery event like learning to ride a bike or simple arithmetic. There are certain practices that help with the process, like body scan or kind of this focusing on the breath. So there are techniques, but the techniques are not mindfulness in and of itself. The technique itself really kind of doesn't matter. It's really that process of paying attention to something in the present moment, non-judgmentally, and accepting whatever comes with that, being able to sit with whatever arises. But I do think of it, kind of in the BMW model, where it's the body, the mind, and the world are things that you could pay attention to. So as I stand here talking to you today, I could pay attention to the feeling of my feet on the floor, the temperature in this room, the sounds outside my room. I've heard a helicopter, a door shut, a conversation in the 10 minutes that we've been talking so far. But that kind of just noticing what's going on, and you've got some things you could choose from. When we think about this as an application in a clinical context, certainly there's a lot of mindfulness-based information in the popular press. It's a little hard to see the top of the slide, but this was the stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, started by John Kabat-Zinn in the late 70s. And what they found, and the reason this became a center, was the medical providers were noticing that, we have all these patients who have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, their insulin functions all over the place, their blood glucose values are all over the place. They're on the right medications. There's nothing else that we haven't found. They've got chronic pain or other illnesses. And the things that we know work aren't working. And, historically, even currently, if modern medicine isn't working, it must be psychiatric. So let's send them to the psychologists. And as a psychologist, I can say that. And what they found was that stress was an important mediator of treatment outcome. And as they started to address stress, lo and behold, blood pressure improves, cholesterol improves, inflammation decreases, people have fewer GI problems, fewer headaches. So this kind of mind-body connection, which of course they're connected, right? The mind is a byproduct or a function of the body. And treating the things that concern the mind help with the body. But this was late 70s. And over time, it has transformed into this center with international partners around mindfulness in medicine, healthcare, and society. And over time, since about the mid-80s, there's been a strong interest in how these approaches can help with things like depression and anxiety. And when you go through the literature, we won't go through all these, but I just wanted to put them up there in case you're someone who is convinced by peer-reviewed studies. There are plenty around mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an 8-week program. There's an increasing body of literature around mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy to improve outcomes with depression, anxiety. Since about the late 70s, early 80s, this was also quickly adapted as an intervention for substance use disorders and pain. So I noticed one of our attendees today may be familiar with this slide, given that in a previous life, I worked as a reluctant pain psychologist at Virginia Mason Medical Center and would frequently employ mindfulness-based interventions to help people deal with chronic pain. And lo and behold, what you find is that as people learn meditation techniques, there are parts of the brain that start to work a little differently. And some of those parts of the brain are involved in the signaling process for pain, including areas of the somatosensory cortex, the frontal lobes, our fight or flight system, that kind of HPA axis driven pieces. And it's not an on-off switch for pain, but it's kind of like a volume knob. And by learning some of these strategies, you can turn the volume down on pain, which becomes incredibly important when you've been dealing with pain for years and years and years, and particularly important if you're not able to or willing or interested in pain medications, which don't always have the greatest efficacy. And this actually came from the Wall Street Journal of all places, but lots of interest in terms of how mindfulness meditation might help with other chronic conditions. One of my favorite cartoons, speaking of medications, is someone on the psychiatrist's couch and says, could we up the dosage? I still have feelings. And I do not put this up here to make light of anybody who is on medications for distress at all, but I do put it up here as a commentary that we have a hard time experiencing distress. And boy, we've got plenty of it to experience right now. And I have historically been interested, and I get the question every once in a while, why did you want to become a neuropsychologist instead of a neurologist or psychiatrist? And I have a strong interest in the things that are not medication-based that help increase resilience and enhance resilience. And the idea of, we have a lot on our plates and we can't take a lot of those things off, right? You can't undo COVID, you can't undo the current political context, you can't undo chronic diseases sometimes. So if you can't take those things off your plate, how can you make your plate bigger and thicker? So that's something I've always been kind of attuned to. And as we think about distress, a lot of this is the story we tell ourselves. And it's a really interesting difference between acute versus chronic pain. The stimulus may be the same, the lesion may be the same, but that story of, oh my gosh, it's been 3 years and I'm still dealing with this, is a big piece of what causes suffering versus pain. Same thing with, again, depression or anxiety. A lot of this is the story we tell ourselves. Some people are more aware of it than others. But one of the stories are, shoulds. I should have been better at that, or I should do this differently, or I shouldn't have done that, or my kids should know to call me. So there's all sorts of things we tell ourselves. And historically, the way cognitive behavioral therapy has worked, a major component of it is that you identify those shoulds, and then you wrestle them into submission, and you put in a new, more adaptive thought. That's a tall order. And again, having done a lot of work with this with folks, frequently what you hear is that I still have the shoulds and I can replace it with a more quote unquote adaptive thought, but I kind of feel like I'm lying to myself. It doesn't really feel genuine. And one of the interesting differences with the mindfulness-based twist on this is you are noticing the shoulds and you are accepting them as, I do this, I have these thoughts. They don't have to lead me around by the nose. I'm not going to not have them. And then you shift your attention to something else. So it's just, again, that acceptance of, I'm not going to replace these, I'm not going to wrestle with them, I'm not going to get rid of them, but I'm also not going to buy into them completely. Kind of this idea of, don't believe everything you think. Okay. And as that work unfolded, this idea of more mindful cognitive behavioral therapy and other kind of mindfulness-based therapies, there turned out to be some interesting questions around, it seems like people are noticing that they are thinking differently. Their processing speed has changed, their attention, their concentration, some aspects of short-term memory. And it wasn't really kind of a focal endpoint kind of for a study at first, but then it did become this over time. And this idea of, well, what's driving that? Is it that you've reduced depression and anxiety? And we know that depression and anxiety are associated with poor short-term memory. Is it that you're doing something different in the brain and it's kind of ramping those areas up? And to answer that question, we do have to spend a little bit of time on basic neuroscience. I won't bore you with this. You're good people and deserve better. But what I will tell you is that, at the macro level, we have these lobes of our brains that do different things. And our occipital lobe, in yellow here, if you can see it, is highly involved with vision and visual processing. As we head into the light green, that's more kind of spatial and visuospatial. Parietal lobes in green, aspects of language and visuospatial function, object recognition. As we get into the temporal lobes in blue, different parts of language, short-term memory, learning, and the frontal lobes in orangey red here are diverse in terms of their function. Things like executive functioning, planning, problem solving, sequencing, working memory, regulating behavior, maintaining awareness. And then the cerebellum also involved in some of those same functions, but also motor movements and coordination, brainstem lower, which regulates things like autonomic function and breathing and heart rate, those kinds of things. And at the micro level, this organ is made up of billions and billions and billions of cells. And the cells are not like the cells you think of in biology with the round cell body and the nucleus and all the other stuff that's inside. These have a cell body, but they also have this long tube, which is an axon, and then what looks like tree branches that connect to other cells. And the way cognitive functioning works is patterns of activation across within and then across cells and across networks in the brain. So as you're listening, the junction, upper junction in the blue and the green is active as you're kind of disentangling what these different sounds mean in terms of words. Other parts of the temporal lobe are involved in remembering either, oh yeah, that reminds me of this, or learning something new. So it's not a one cell equals one memory or one cognitive functioning, nor is it one part of the brain is completely connected to one type of cognitive functioning. And what you find as you think about what happens to the brain under stress, and over time, in significant chronic stress, so we're not talking just about, life is difficult. This is, post-traumatic stress disorder. These are people with combat trauma or physical trauma, otherwise physical assaults. So untreated PTSD, you see shrinkage in both the neurons and in the regions of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which are involved in attention and memory. And you actually see increases in the complexity of the cells and the structures themselves in the amygdala and other parts of the frontal cortex, which are involved in threat appraisal. So that part of our system, our brain, that monitors the environment for the next hit or the next threat or the next thing that's going to go wrong, those get larger, but then they can't sustain that, and over time they also get smaller and shrink. And some of this is cortisol production. There are other stress hormones that are neurotoxic. It also impacts sleep. It changes diet, other behavioral kind of things like substance use. So there's a number of things that co-occur with PTSD, but certainly cortisol and other stress hormones being neurotoxic are a piece of this. So when we look at those neurons under a microscope, and these are magnified animal model brain cells, basically. Up on the top are control cells, and in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, under chronic stress, you can see that there aren't as many branches. It's a simpler cell. And over on the right side here on your screen, in the control amygdala and orbitofrontal, so the part up above your eyes, that's a pretty normal looking cell, but you see one that's even more complex in those threat appraisal areas. So again, just some of the cellular level changes that occur. Why this becomes important as we think about something like Alzheimer's disease is the significant overlap in architecture and territory in terms of the parts of the brain that begin to change first in something like Alzheimer's disease. And we have a greater understanding now over the last decade or so that Alzheimer's disease is one that begins many, many, many years, 10, 15, 20 years before symptoms are evident. So the pathological changes in the brain, the amyloid plaques or the tau tangles that you've likely heard about, are occurring in our 50s or maybe even our 40s, whereas the memory symptoms that come about later on don't start to show up until maybe mid-60s. And the middle of the temporal lobe, the hippocampus, is one of the areas where this occurs first. And again, if you think back, that's one of the areas that's most sensitive to stress. So one thought is that chronic stress may be something that opens the door or speeds up the unfolding of something like Alzheimer's disease. And lo and behold, of the many pathways to something like Alzheimer's, That certainly seems like it is one, and may lead to a very kind of a different presentation than some other forms of Alzheimer's disease. So that's something else that we've come to appreciate more recently, is that there's a tremendous amount of variability in something that we call the same. You know, if you think back 30, 40 years ago, everything was called senility, and there wasn't much differentiation of Alzheimer's versus vascular versus frontotemporal or Lewy body. And I think we kind of do the same thing now, where in not too long, there'll be these subtypes of Alzheimer's disease that you hear about versus just a general kind of bucket term. But that's for another talk and another time. So important to think about this kind of continuum of the disease. And if you've attended any of my illustrious colleagues' presentations, I'm sure you've heard about this already. And the importance of disentangling the disease from the dementia. So you could have the plaques and the tangles, which are the hallmarks of the disease, but way back in time, there aren't going to be any symptoms. So that would be a preclinical phase versus mild cognitive impairment versus dementia, which is just more severe symptoms and more severe functional change. And one idea, kind of a radical idea, is that if we can intervene early, could we keep people from getting to the late stages or even to the stages of dementia and keep people in the preclinical or the MCI phase? And one of the things that we're deeply interested in is how do we manage stress in earlier life if that is a contributing factor. So I am not offering you the suggestion that mindfulness meditation is a cure for Alzheimer's disease. I'm not offering you the suggestion that it's a disease-modifying treatment for Alzheimer's disease. I am offering you the suggestion that it's a way to help cope with some of the difficulties that can come with it. And it may be something that shapes risk. We don't know yet. Studies haven't been done. I'm gonna skip that. The other thing that we've been deeply interested in is in this kind of concept of not everybody gets Alzheimer's disease. And not everybody with Alzheimer's disease gets Alzheimer's dementia. So what is that, right? Well, how does that happen? And the idea that brains can be wildly variable in old age. They can be in younger ages too, but the other question I get often is, why on earth did you want to go into this field and work with people with degenerative dementias? And for me, the idea of working with older adults who have the widest range of possible functional and cognitive abilities is fascinating. There's nothing more challenging in the way. And it's amazing to see people in their 90s who are cognitively as sharp as they maybe would have been in their 50s or 60s. And then you have people in their 50s and 60s who have fairly advanced Alzheimer's disease. So the amount of heterogeneity is incredible. And thinking about how can we, and how can you, ensure, maybe increase the likelihood that as somebody in your 8th or 9th decade, your brain's going to look like the one on the bottom, not in the middle row. And lo and behold, we have a lot more data about that in the last couple of years around prevention and interventions. And this really lovely updated Lancet study that would say about 40% of all dementias are preventable, and that's a lifespan intervention, including childhood, improving early childhood education, midlife, addressing hearing loss, dealing with stress well, reducing head injuries, late life, treating blood pressure, stopping smoking if you smoke. So there's all these pieces that add up to about 40% elimination of dementia. You might still have the disease, but don't develop the dementia. So back to meditation and thinking about how does that interact with our thinking. One is that there is some really robust evidence that there are changes in the structure of the brain. And meditation is a way to kind of dictate that. Some of it is the deeper white matter tracts. So in the brain, you have gray matter, which is kind of the part that's on the surface. It's relatively thin. And then the deeper part of the brain is, it's like a fiber tract, basically, the connectivity between regions of the brain. So those connective tracts or pathways get thicker and get stronger. And those particularly happen in the connections from the frontal lobes to some of the subcortical and posterior structures. And you also get some change in function. So the way the frontal lobes work and the way the parietal lobes work, and particularly the connectivity between those that's called the default mode network. And this is kind of the pattern of activity that occurs in your brain when you're at rest. If you're just sitting and doing nothing, which you need to do at times, The brain has a particular kind of pattern of which regions are active and talking to each other. And that becomes more robust with the meditation practice. Why that is important is that how robust that network is dictates and predicts how quickly you can switch into a task when something presents itself. So if you're sitting and doing nothing and just kind of letting your mind wander, and someone comes up to you and starts having a conversation, how quickly you can kind of reorient to what they're saying and whether or not you can get it the first time versus saying, huh, what? Hearing notwithstanding. There are also changes in the cognitive skills that are related to some of that architecture. So with practice and meditation, people are able to process information more quickly and more efficiently. And this is one of the things that changes the most as we age, particularly around 55 to 60. Certain components of attention, particularly selective attention, so that freedom from distractibility of there's something competing for your attention and your ability to filter it out. So right now there's another helicopter coming in here at Harborview, and my ability to filter that out and keep talking and present about this is a good indication of selective attention abilities. Working memory, your ability to hold things in mind and manipulate them. And then certainly also some components of executive functioning, particularly thinking flexibly about something. And I like to think about this as I'm doing something, it's not going according to plan, and my ability to both recognize that instead of staying stuck and trying to beat my head against the wall to get it done, versus stepping back and saying, okay, that's not working. What else could I try? I could try this, that. Oh, this one sounds good. And that's a good kind of example of mental flexibility. We won't go through all of these, but again, if you are encouraged by or swayed by evidence-based literature and peer-reviewed studies, these are some of the better ones that look at different types of meditation, which parts of the brain are affected, kind of what does it mean. And the one that I will draw your attention to, because it also lists the number of people that are involved in these studies, and you'll see that they're very small. These are not extraordinarily well-funded studies. This is not a major area of NIH or NIA priority, which is fine. But it kind of limits how generalizable they may be, and there's methodological problems in all of these. But they also have, in one of these columns, experience with meditation. And as you can see, some of these folks have 2 decades, 2.5 decades. But this third from bottom, 0. And this was the one that caught my eye, because these are meditation naive folks. They've never done it before. And what happens if you take somebody who's never meditated before and you teach them how to do it? They agree to practice it. And that's one of the things that probably deserves some attention also, is that this is not something someone can do to you, right? I mean, this is a thing that you have to do. And sometimes that's a challenge because we want the quick fix, we want the pill, we want the thing that helps right away, or that someone can do to us. Versus, you mean I have to spend 20 minutes a day practicing this thing that's kind of boring and painful in a way, and it's hard. But if you get somebody's buy-in and they actually do practice it, you see changes in terms of cortical thickness in the left hippocampus, the posterior cingulate gyrus, and temporoparietal junction, which is a kind of association cortex, and cerebellum. And you see improvements in someone's ability to learn new information, remember it later on, and that emotional regulation, that kind of decreased emotional reactivity. And of all the things I think that mindfulness, at least in my practice of it, has been most appreciated, is that kind of decreased emotional reactivity, of not getting all wrapped around the axle about stuff that isn't going right or didn't go according to plan or it's not working how I wanted it to work. And not to be like, I don't care, dispassionate, but okay, I have emotions about that, but I'm not gonna let that drive the bus. I guess that's a way to think about it. And if you are familiar with fMRI and cortical thickness studies, this is a composite of pre-posts. So this is an MRI of the brain, before and after, about a year in between training and then practice of mindfulness meditation. And these are areas of the brain that are thicker following practice. This is a group, kind of a composite image. And this yellow part on the upper left is part of the anterior cingulate gyrus and the intersection with the frontal lobe. On the bottom one, that's just kind of looking at it from top down, it's the same structure. And then the one up on the upper right is kind of looking at it head on, more of a coronal slice. As we think about how that may shape risk for Alzheimer's disease, so we've got some good evidence that, okay, so this changes the structure of the brain, it changes the function of the brain, not in global wholesale ways, not maybe even in ways that are profoundly disease modifying, but could it be applied to something like Alzheimer's disease? And what we know from years and years of research from colleagues at University of California in Los Angeles and John Kabat-Zinn's work is that there's a reduction or better control of blood pressure, cholesterol, depression, anxiety, all these things that we know are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So if you can manage those better in midlife or late life, there's maybe some disease modification. We know that individuals who meditate have better blood flow to different regions of the brain that are sensitive to the early changes of Alzheimer's disease. We know that the white matter networks are a little bit more robust. There's less inflammation in the body, which is another pathway, potential pathway to something like Alzheimer's disease, other dementias. Less cortisol floating around. And there are some downstream effects of treating these things, including lower alcohol use, and that's also been associated with attempts to control stress or treat mood symptoms. People will kind of self-medicate with alcohol. And alcohol overuse is certainly a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and not good for your brain overall. So if we can decrease that as a kind of an ill-advised coping strategy, does that also help? So there may be some direct pathways, there may be some indirect pathways. All of this is really kind of hypothetical. We don't fully know. But I will share with you, I was on a national call for our Alzheimer's disease research centers about 2 weeks ago. And to hear one of the most esteemed, kind of dyed-in-the-wool, old-school scientists talk about we need more studies about meditation for Alzheimer's disease. That's both maybe a risk modifying and a treatment. I was blown away. I did not expect to hear that. So it's interesting to see it kind of filter into, even some of our most rigorously minded individuals. So some credibility there. If we look at studies that are out there, and there aren't a ton, but there are a couple of decent ones in terms of how they were designed. This one by Newberg and colleagues from 2010 did an 8-week meditation program, and that is kind of the standard duration for mindfulness-based stress reduction. And as a control group, they had a relaxation intervention where they had people listening to relaxing music. And this was a small sample, 15 people. And 7 of them were cognitively healthy older adults. 5 had mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease, and 3 had Alzheimer's dementia, early stage Alzheimer's dementia. And this is one of the studies where they looked at blood flow to the brain. And sure enough, the auditory cortex, which is up at that junction of the kind of the temporal lobe near where the parietal lobe intersects, blood flow there improved, and up to the prefrontal regions up here, up above your eyes, laterally. And that's a critical structure in terms of flexible thinking, the front end kind of components of learning and memory, kind of organizing information, getting it packaged to be able to be remembered later on. And there was reduced blood flow to the parietal lobes back towards the posterior part of the brain, which doesn't sound good because you would think you'd want more blood flow to places, but that is actually a good indicator of that default mode network robustness. So the fact that that was lowered is a better, it's a good thing. We'll stick with that. And as they measured cognition, things like verbal fluency, that ability to kind of pay attention to multiple things at the same time, which we don't really do, but we kind of switch back and forth between things. And your efficiency with that predicts task success, and your ability to remember things that happened recently. Those all improved. So on standardized cognitive testing. Was it enough of an improvement to change the course of the disease? No, absolutely not. Was it enough of an improvement to keep somebody more functionally independent, managing their medications, or their finances, or their driving? They didn't measure that. Don't know. But interesting. And here is another kind of a composite image, kind of bird's eye view, top down of the brain. So the top of the screen are the before the program, the bottom are the afterwards. This is 6 months after the intervention. And you can see the way, this is a PET scan, FDG PET, so this is measuring glucose utilization in the brain. And I am now noticing that helicopter is gone, and boy, I have some gratitude for less noise interference. So you can see the darker red is more activity, and blue or black is no activity. And that should be blue and black. Those are the ventricles. It's fluid that kind of circulates in the brain. So here, the anterior cingulate gyrus, it's that same thing that you saw in yellow on the MRI, is firing at a greater rate. It's working a little bit better. And the prefrontal cortex kind of out here on the side is also with some increased activity. And it's kind of trendy. I'm not sure you can see it, if you can see where my mouse is here, but here's the parietal lobe here, and it's a little less red down here. So there's that kind of decrease in activity, which again is a good thing. Similar study looked at, again, an 8-week program, 14 people with mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease, and they were randomly selected to usual care or this mindfulness-based stress reduction group. And here they looked at, again, communication of those regions in the brain and found that the posterior cingulate gyrus and the frontal cortex were talking to each other better. The posterior cingulate cortex and left hippocampus were talking to each other better. And these are important things in terms of, again, getting information into the brain and keeping it there, as well as being able to pull it back out later on when you need it. And they did also measure volume of the hippocampus. And we know that the hippocampus shrinks both as we get older, but it certainly shrinks a lot more in something like Alzheimer's disease. And here, there was a trend to kind of stabilizing that versus continued deterioration, but small sample, hard to demonstrate something like that. Hard to demonstrate something like that in a huge sample, but especially in something this small. And here's your kind of mean change for the two groups. Well, what about people who are care partners for somebody with Alzheimer's disease or dementia? I would offer you that as somebody with a personal connection to the disease, being a family member and a care partner is inherently stressful. Having cognitive changes is stressful also. And looking at what happens when you teach care partners how to do meditation. So here, it was, again, a smallish study, but 12 minutes a day. Care partners do not have a lot of time to spare. You can't spend, 45 minutes doing something. So 12 minutes, they pared it down. Usually 20 is about the recommended dosage. And again, relaxation was the control group. They found significant improvements in mood, self-reports of cognitive function, and self-reports of overall just resilience. I feel like I can handle this better. It's still hard, but I feel like I can handle it better. And their outcome, their objective outcome, was a very interesting marker of cellular aging, and that of telomere length. And telomeres, if you're not familiar, are kind of the protective cap at the end of your genetic material, kind of like the thing at the end of your shoelaces that keeps your shoelaces from splaying apart and fraying. We have these at the ends of our genes, which cellular integrity is critical for that. And what they found is that those telomeres were longer in the group that did meditation. So the blue on the meditation group and the relaxation group, the light blue, are the measures before, and then the purplish is afterwards. And this was a 6-month follow-up. So as we head towards the 3 o'clock hour here, I also wanted to include some other concepts and adjuncts I think that are useful. And one very important one is self-compassion. And there's some mindfulness-based self-compassion interventions, I think, that are quite good, and really emphasizing self-kindness and not self-pity. And self-compassion, I think of it in a very balanced, you can't be too hard on yourself. You also can't be too easy on yourself. Right? You got to be somewhere in the middle where you can't let yourself off the hook all the time, but can't beat yourself up all the time either. And that piece of, again, being aware and engaged, and acknowledging that we don't always get it right. Our 100% is not always 100%, and you're working on it. You're doing the best you can. The other thing that I wanted to come back to, and I took this from somebody I worked with, oh my gosh, about 12 years ago. It's when I just started at Virginia Mason. The idea of acceptance, of not giving up, right? So, and the quote that I took from her was, I can't fight this, so I might as well dance with it and lead as much as possible. So I can't change it, I can't fix it. This was someone who had a different neurological disease, but accepted the fact, okay, I have this, I have some limitations, I have to change my life in some ways, but I'm gonna do that. So I also think of acceptance in terms of like the weather. You have to accept the fact that it rains here in the Northwest. You can't deny that. You can't kind of argue with the universe or the weather gods. I mean, you can, but it's not going to change anything. It doesn't mean that you don't get a good raincoat or an umbrella, right? And I think, again, that's acceptance. Yeah, it rains. What do I do about that? So in summary, in the name of having a couple of minutes to field any questions if you have them, mindfulness-based interventions are a long-standing practice, and I feel a little bit ambivalent about this in the sense that I feel like it's something that doesn't need to be validated by modern research techniques. It is what it is, right? But it's nice to know why it may do some of the things it does, and certainly as we want to be careful consumers about the things we could be trying or doing, your time and your energy are limited. So what it is you choose to invest in and what that return on that investment may be is a really important consideration. It is not a cure-all. It is not something that yields benefits, even tangible benefits, right out of the gate. I will, in the name of kind of my personal relationship with this, I started this when I was 10 years old as part of martial arts, and didn't know it was mindfulness meditation right at first, but it's been 36 years, and I struggle with the practice of this. It's not easy, right? It's simple, but it's not easy. So there you go, I'll leave you with that. And I also want to leave you with some gratitude that we get to do these kinds of talks, and I am honored to be one of the team members here at the University of Washington Memory and Brain Wellness Center. And we are honored to be able to offer these and other talks as part of an ongoing and long-standing partnership with Era Living. There's our website. We do a lot of different things here, and we have some amazing community programs. We've got research studies. We've got a strong kind of advancement and philanthropy department. So we've got all kinds of people to talk to if you're interested in getting involved in any certain way. I'm going to thank you for your attention. I'll put this back up in a second. I want to leave you with some resources. If you were interested in finding out more, and I really just kind of offer this for your consideration. So Mindfulness Northwest is a good resource. The Seattle Mindfulness Center is also a very good resource. I have had the honor of leading the mindfulness meditation at the Fry Art Museum for the last couple of years, which is on hold at the moment. Although they did ask me to record about, I guess maybe 7 or 8 different meditations, and they're on the website. So if you're curious what this actually looks like, some of them are only like 3 minutes. There's one that's maybe 20 minutes. And I would definitely direct you to the master himself, John Kabat-Zinn's work. Mindfulness for Beginners is an excellent one. And the CD version of this, or the audiobook version, is highly recommended, in that the second part of it are a series of guided meditations. The full package is this book here, the Full Catastrophe Living book. It is dense. I would not recommend that as your first foray into this. But the Mindfulness for Beginners is excellent. There's a bunch of references and resources. You'll have those on your slides. I will leave this up for a second. both as my contact information. That's my phone that I'm looking at right here in my office. That is my email address. That is my office right there. I also put this up just as a reminder too that I'm not in the ivory tower of the University of Washington. I'm in the brick tower of Harborview. So, what else? I think we've got about 5 minutes or so. I'll stop screen sharing so people can see each other. If you have questions or comments, let's do this.
There is a question if you see that, Dr. Rhoads.
I see a couple of questions. Studies all seem to be small. That is very true. Is there evidence that improved structural improvement lasts if the practice stops? Very good question. And that's we just had this conversation this morning with a whole different line of research of what happens if you stop doing these things. And my suspicion is no. I think this is a practice that but the studies that were done did not do a 1 year, did not do a 36-month follow-up. That would be the next step. And it would be interesting, two things. One is how many people continued their practice. And I alluded to the fact that it's not easy. It's facilitated by having an individual practice and a group practice. That helps. But how many people continue to do it, and how long does the benefit last? But even for our intervention studies, there's good data that would say once people stop certain things, there may not be any persistent benefit. Perfusion, blood flow. Yeah, so just how much blood is flowing to the brain. How do you improve perfusion? The easiest way is to exercise. So if it's safe to do so from a cardiovascular or heart or musculoskeletal orthopedic standpoint, exercising sends a bunch of extra blood to the brain, and there are all kinds of great benefits that are associated with that. That's a very good question. Yeah, thank you for the questions around terminology. I try to de-jargon these talks, and I miss stuff all the time. Other questions? I want to say hi to Donna. I see you there. Nice to see you. Well, and if you think of questions and have any, you've got my contact information. You'll have it on the slides that get sent out to you. I'm happy to try to answer them or point you to people who would be experts who could answer them. It's one of the things, the other things I love about where I work is work with a tremendous variety of expertise, and there's some great resources here. So.
Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Dr. Rhoads. We really appreciate your time and all the knowledge you shared with us today for this presentation. So if there are no further questions, we will wrap this up. All right. So so I will email a copy of the slides to all the people who are in the presentation right today, and the presenter's contact information. We will also include a survey sheet we'd like you to fill out and tell us about your experience on the Zoom event today. So we are experimenting with the way we present information on COVID during the restrictions, and we'd love to hear from you on how to make it a better experience. So how we can make everything better for you and easier and just a better overall experience. So with that, again, I'm DeWitt. I'm from Aljoya Thornton Place, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and have a great day, everyone.